Okay, so here we want to talk about some potential shortcomings, and there are a lot of shortcomings to GDP. Okay, so for example, for a long period of time, basically prior to about 1950, women typically stayed at home and took care of the house or the kids, right? Not saying, and I'm not saying that this is a good or a bad thing, I'm just saying that it was, okay? This household production, right? So household production did not count towards GDP, right? Even though it was valuable, right? Or did, or does not count, right? And so, excuse me, this household production doesn't count. And so if you work at home and clean the house, mow the lawn, paint the walls, or whatever, that doesn't count as productive activity in terms of GDP. However, if you paid somebody to mow the lawn, that would count towards GDP. If you paid someone to shovel your driveway, that would count as GDP. If you did it yourself, however, that does not count as GDP, right? And so it's interesting that just because you pay someone, it suddenly starts counting. And so if you wanted to boost GDP, you should actually never clean your house, but instead you should pay your neighbor, let's say $100 to clean your house, and have them pay you $100 to clean their house. And by doing so, GDP would increase by $200, right? Now that seems a bit strange that like just giving people money to do things makes it count as productive activity, and if you're not getting money, it doesn't count as productive activity. That seems a bit strange. And so one source of growth in GDP over the last 30 or 40 years has actually been the increased number of women entering the workforce, right? Just simply because there's more women working, GDP has now increased. Okay. It also does not count the underground economy. Right? And the underground economy is typically thought of as the black market, but it doesn't have to be, drugs or something like that. It could be something as innocent as, food. So one of the largest providers of food in Soviet Russia was actually the underground economy, right? Or if you think about gasoline during the 70s when there was a oil shortage, people would meet under bridges and sell gas there, including the police officers, by the way. The police officers would buy gas on the black market during the gas shortage because that was where you could get it, right? And so GDP ignores the value of all of these things, right? But if we think more illicitly, GDP ignores like the value of drug consumption, right? Which we can quibble about whether or not drugs should be legal or anything like that, but it is a sale, right? When you purchase drugs, like you are buying something, which means that thing had to be produced, right? And so GDP could be grossly understating what's actually being produced in a country, right? And again, I'm not saying that drugs should be legalized or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying, but they are productive, right? It is a thing that people buy, and we might want to count it, right? And so, Colombia, for example, is probably much wealthier than their official GDP figures would reveal. But at the same time, Italy is actually much poorer because starting, very recently, they started counting drug sales and prostitution towards GDP. And so that obviously increased the GDP figure, but it didn't exactly end them and their recession or anything like that. It just boosted their economy. Okay? Now, at the same time, it doesn't. We don't know anything about the underlying composition of an economy, right, from GDP. right? So if we think about this, like this is saying that maybe an economy has a really high amount of government spending, and that's why their GDP is so high. But I submit to you that an economy that has more consumption and investment, or at least the same amount of consumption and investment as another country does in total government spending, the former country is probably doing much better, right? Countries where consumption is high, investment is high, and government spending is low or at least moderate, right, are probably much healthier than an economy that has the same GDP figure that is composed entirely of government spending. Okay, and so we don't. But from GDP figures alone, we don't know anything about that. Right. A way to think about this is to see or to recognize that this is sort of like saying people that are the same height and the same weight might be wildly different. Okay, so you might not have ever seen me before, but I am 6'1". I weigh 217 pounds right now, which is the same height and weight as Adrian Peterson, right, the running back for the Minnesota Vikings. Now, clearly, if you were to see me, you would recognize that Adrian Peterson is composed, or his composition, his body composition, is very different from mine, right? He is significantly stronger than I am, right? But in terms of our height and weight, we're exactly identical, okay? We also do not account for pollution, right? So if we pollute the environment, that doesn't count as negative GDP, right? But interestingly, we do count cleaning the environment, right? So cleaning the environment counts as GDP, but making pollution does not count as negative GDP. Okay? We don't adjust for crime. Right? But hiring police does count. Right? So we don't adjust it downward for crime, but we adjust it upward when we hire increased police officers. Okay? And so while there are several shortcomings to GDP, and they make it seem somewhat of a ridiculous statistic, GDP is not entirely useless. Okay? It can tell us some useful things. So think about when you were younger and you wanted to stay home from school. So you would cough, right? And your mom or your dad or someone would come in and they'd probably stick a thermometer in your mouth, right, and take your temperature. And if you leave the thermometer in your mouth and get a temperature of your mouth, right, that can tell you if you're starting to feel sick, right? It can't tell you a whole lot, right? It's not going to tell you what's causing your sickness or anything like that, but it can tell you that you're sick, right? But if you get to stay home, if the thermometer reads something significantly different from 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the average temperature, what could you do? Well, you could stick your thermometer under a lamp, right? And all of a sudden, it says that you're running a fever of, 140 degrees, right? And so there, you can manipulate, what the thermometer reads, right? And so but if you don't manipulate it, if you're not manipulating what's going on, then the temperature actually does tell you some useful information. The same thing is true of GDP, right? As long as we're not manipulating it and trying to, boost it or decrease it or do anything, as long as we're just honestly, putting the thermometer in our mouths or taking, the economy's temperature, right, so to speak, GDP is not entirely useless. It's not very useful, but it's not completely and utterly useless. Okay, so GDP, for all its faults, still does have some uses. And so the last thing we'll do today is we're going to go over this concept called gross national product. Okay, so gross national product is the same thing as GDP, but it's about the people and businesses that are citizens or owned by citizens of a country regardless of where they're located in the world. Okay, so Toyota has car plants in the U.S. Okay, so those car plants, the production of those cars would count towards U.S. GDP because they are made within the United States, but because Toyota is a Japanese-owned company, they would count towards Japan's GNP, right? Likewise, the stuff made by Apple in China would count towards the US GNP because Apple owns those factories, but they count towards China's GDP because they're made in China. Okay, for the most part, there's very little difference between using GNP and GDP, but some people like to use GNP every now and then. Very few people do, but I want you to be aware of what it is just in case you come across it. Okay, so again, GDP is all the stuff that is made within a geographic region like the United States. GNP is all the stuff made by citizens of the United States or the companies that the citizens own, regardless of where it is in the world. Okay, and so that is, in a nutshell, GDP, its shortcomings, and GNP as well.